Good morning. Today I want to read some of John Ashbery's poem, The Recital. This is a prose poem. It's in his book, Three Poems, which consists of three long prose poems. It was published in 1972. The first two poems, The New Spirit and The System, are very long. The recital is not quite as long. I'm going to begin reading the recital. All right. The problem is that there is no new problem. It must awaken from the sleep of being part of some other old problem, and by that time its new problematical existence will have already begun, carrying it forward into situations with which it cannot cope, since no one recognizes it, and it does not even recognize itself yet, or know what it is. It is like the beginning of a beautiful day, with all the birds singing in the trees, reading their joy and excitement into its record as it progresses, and yet the progress of any day, good or bad, brings with it all kinds of difficulties that should have been foreseen but never are, so that it finally seems as though they are what stifles it, in the majesty of a sunset, or merely in gradual dullness that gets dimmer and dimmer until it finally sinks into flat, sour darkness. Why is this? Because not 1/10 or even 1/100th of the ravishing possibilities the birds sing about at dawn could ever be realized in the course of a single day, no matter how crammed with fortunate events it might turn out to be. And this brings on inevitable reproaches, unmerited of course, for we are all like children sulking because they cannot have the moon. And very soon the unreasonableness of these demands is forgotten and overwhelmed in a wave of melancholy of which it is the sole cause. Finally, we know only that we are unhappy, but we cannot tell why. We forget that it is our own childishness that is to blame. That this is true is of course beyond argument. But we ought to look into the nature of that childishness a little more. Try to figure out where it came from and how, if at all, we can uproot it. And when we first start to examine it, biased as we are, it seems as though we are not entirely to blame. We have all or most of us had unhappy childhoods. Later on, we tried to patch things up as we entered the years of adulthood. It was a relief for a while that everything was succeeding. We had finally left that long, suffocating tunnel and emerged into an open place. We could not yet see very well due to the abrupt change from darkness to daylight, but we were beginning to make out things. We embarked on a series of adult relationships from which the sting and malignancy of childhood were absent, or so it seemed. No more hiding behind bushes to get a glimpse of the others. No more unspeakable rages of jealousy or the suffocation of unrequited or unrealizable love. Or at least these things retreated into their proper perspective as new things advanced into the foreground. New feelings, as yet too complex to be named or closely inspected, but in which the breathless urgency of those black and white situations of childhood happily played no part. It became a delight to enumerate all the things in the new world our maturity had opened up for us, as inexhaustible in pleasures and fertile pursuits as some more down-to-earth Eden from which the utopian joys as well as the torments of that older fantasy world had been banished by a more reasonable deity. But as the days and years sped by, it became apparent that the naming of all the new things we now possessed had become our chief occupation. That very little time for the mere tasting and having of them was left over, and that even these simple, tangible experiences were themselves subject to description and enumeration, or else they too became fleeting and transient as the song of a bird that is uttered only once and disappears into the backlog of vague memories, where it becomes as a dried, pressed flower, a wistful parody of itself. Meanwhile, all our energies are being absorbed by the task of trying to revive those memories, make them real, as if to live again were the only reality, and the overwhelming variety of the situations we have to deal with begins to submerge our efforts. It becomes plain that we cannot interpret everything. We must be selective. And so the tale we are telling begins little by little to leave reality behind. It is no longer so much our description of the way things happen to us as our private song sung in the wilderness. Nor can we leave off singing, for that would be to retreat to the death of childhood, to the mere acceptance and dull living of all that is thrust upon us, a living death in a word. We must register our appraisal of the moving world that is around us. But our song is leading us on now, farther and farther into that wilderness and away from the shrouded but familiar forms that were its first inspiration. On and on into the gathering darkness. Is there no remedy for this?